I appreciated David's offering appeal and reminding us of the value of religious liberty and the necessity of advocating for continued religious liberty. You know, it's good to think about liberty. What does liberty mean? Well, it means freedom, the opportunity to choose, the freedom to choose. The reality is, while we talk about liberty and we think about we live in the land of the free, there's something about the United States of America, a land of freedom and liberty and opportunity. The reality is that anywhere you go, in any country that you might be in, there is universal liberty of thought. Wherever you go, you have the freedom to think as you choose. You could be in the most dictatorial and freedom-absent country in the world, and you still have the freedom of thought, liberty of thought. You can be in prison. You have liberty of thought. You can be in church. You have liberty of thought. You always have liberty of thought. But you don't always have liberty of expression. When we think about and we talk about liberty, religious liberty or civil liberties, we're not thinking about liberty of thought. We're thinking about liberty of expression, of you having the choice, the freedom to express your thoughts in a way that allows you to express those thoughts without recrimination or without punishment or without negative consequence. Liberty. We value liberty. And we recognize that we live in a world where liberties will diminish. From our understanding of Bible prophecy, liberties will diminish. And yet the reality is that we will always live with a dichotomy of liberty or lack of liberty. We're going to look at two verses this morning, two passages, one in Matthew, one in Revelation. We're going to contrast God's approach with Satan's approach. But before we look at those two passages, I want you to reflect with me on the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. I have a question for you. Was there religious liberty in the nation of Israel? In the system that God set up when He brought the children of Israel out of slavery, out of bondage in Egypt, and He led them through the wilderness and then to the promised land, was there religious liberty? Well, there was religious liberty if you were an Israelite and you chose to believe and follow the teachings of God. There was a society that provided wonderful liberty. But what if, as a citizen of the nation of Israel, you decided that you were going to follow paganism, or that you were going to worship one of the many or numerous gods that the surrounding nations had? What was the prescription that God had given on how to deal with someone who chose not to follow the true God? Well, at a minimum, you were to be cut off. That means you couldn't participate in the religious ceremonies and festivals and worship of God's people. But it likely also included either being banished from the nation or, more likely, being executed because you had chosen a different path from the one God had prescribed. So here's the question. Was there religious liberty in the nation of Israel? Not in the way that we think of religious liberty. We don't think of religious liberty that way. We would think, no, there was no religious liberty for the nation of Israel. I had lunch once early in my ministry as a pastor with a gentleman who was a development director for an organization that my church was very involved in. It was, there were a number of ministries in this small community that a lot of the churches worked together to support. One was a food bank. Another was a free clinic to provide medical care to those who didn't have access to medical care otherwise. And then also there was a crisis pregnancy center that provided resources typically to unmarried expectant mothers who might be considering different approaches to dealing with pregnancy, and the Crisis Pregnancy Center provided counseling and resources and encouragement to care for and value that unborn life. And then once a baby was born, to provide diapers and formula and babysitting and all sorts of support so that that young lady could care for that new life. And so our church was involved in these ministries in our community, and the development director for the organization that helped all of those ministries took me to lunch one day, and we began to talk about liberty and religious liberty. And he shared with me that his vision for the United States was that we would return to what the nation of Israel was like, that we would adopt and enforce all of the rules and laws that God had prescribed for the nation of Israel. And he felt that was what the United States of America needed. And I countered and says, well, I disagree with that. We live in a pluralistic society that doesn't work when it was God's prescription for the nation of Israel back in the Old Testament. That was a theocracy. It was a community that was led by God. God had prophets, and he would directly speak. In the wilderness, there was Moses, and God would invite him up to Mount Sinai and talk to him and even write things down for him. There was the high priest, and God would communicate through the high priest. There was the visible presence of God in the most holy place, hovering above the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. That was a different reality than we live in today. That was a theocracy. God directly communicated his will, and when God's people were at their best, they followed God's will. We don't live in that kind of society today. We don't live in a theocracy. We don't have a leader that is invited to the top of Mount Sinai and God speaks to him. We don't have a high priest that God can miraculously communicate his will through. We don't have active prophets that are accepted and valued by society. A theocracy doesn't work today. He says, well, no, I believe that's what we need. We need a return to God. And we need to, he said, so if someone commits adultery, we need to stone them. And if, a whole host of things. And I said, if you really believe that, I said, the reality is that very quickly, my church would be the only one that still exists. And he said, what do you mean? I says, well, I'm a pastor of a Seventh-day Adventist church. And we believe in the Bible Sabbath. We worship on the seventh-day Sabbath. We keep the Sabbath holy by God's grace. And the Bible makes it clear in the Old Testament that if someone breaks the Sabbath in the nation of Israel, what was supposed to happen to them? Do you remember? They were to be stoned. That's right. Remember when someone was caught collecting sticks for a fire on the Sabbath in the wilderness? And what did God say do? Stone them. So what is the biblical prescription in a theocracy for breaking the Sabbath? Death. And so I told him, I says, if you really believe that in our nation we need to get back to all of those rules that God gave us in the Old Testament, and I'm not using rules in a negative sense, those wonderful guidelines that God gave his people, we learn from, and by God's grace we follow those principles and apply those principles to our lives today. If you think we should do that, then my church is the only one that will still exist. Because by and large, my church is the only one. In fact, in that community, my church was the only one who worshiped on Sabbath. I said, so the rest of you are going to be stoned pretty quickly. Well, he wasn't sure about that. He said he'd have to think that one over a little bit. He wasn't willing to adopt the Sabbath. After all, we had been made free from the Sabbath. That was his understanding. And so he didn't want to adopt that. But he said all the other ones, he says, we should adopt. Just maybe not the Sabbath. And so I looked at what he was eating, and I says, well, there's another problem. He was having bacon, which I pointed out to him was something that also the Bible said for God's people that wasn't supposed to be permitted. He actually grew up on a pig farm. And so I told him that was going to be a problem as well. Anyhow, so you get the point, right? The reality is we recognize we can't recapture the theodicy, a nation directly led by God, that's not a reality today. That was God's plan for the nation of Israel, and unfortunately, God's people chose not to follow that. They says, we actually don't like God being our king. We don't like living in a theodicy. We would like a human leader that we can choose and we can anoint. We want to be like the other nations. And even God's people, when they had what should have been the ideal society, with God directly and actively, daily involved in the leading of their nation, they said no. So was the nation of Israel, was there religious liberty? Well, no, there wasn't. Not if you decided that you wanted to break the Sabbath. Not if you decided that you wanted to ignore God's rules about, or the commandment, the sixth commandment, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. There wasn't freedom for that. If you decided that you wanted to worship differently than God prescribed, there wasn't freedom for that. There was no religious liberty in the nation of Israel. But if you loved the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your might, and you desired to follow the God of heaven and earth, then there was lots of freedom. There was lots of liberty. What makes the difference? I want to invite you to go with me to Matthew. Actually, let's go to Revelation first, and then we'll work our way back. Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. We don't live in a theodicy today, and we think about religious liberty. We can be grateful that we don't live in a theodicy here in our country, because if we lived in a nation where religious beliefs and practices were codified into law, the reality is it wouldn't be your religious beliefs and practices codified into law. It would be the majority religious beliefs and practices codified into law. And while some of those religious beliefs and practices might mirror your religious beliefs and practices, there would be others that would not. There would be others that would severely limit your ability to freely live out your faith. Revelation chapter 13 describes for us, Revelation chapter 13 describes a beast power at the end time, a unity of church and state where government meddles in religion and religion tries to control government. And this is an approach that is encouraged and supported and directed by the dragon, and the dragon, of course, is Satan. But you can notice what happens in the last days when this religious civil power, we don't have the time this afternoon to dive into the identity of this power, but we can look at the attributes, the characteristics, and recognize this is not God's approach. First of all, he, beginning in verse 11, speaks about the lamb-like beast, the one that comes up out of the earth, and we recognize that as a symbol of the United States. You can continue on and see in verse 14 that deception is a key characteristic of this beast power, following Satan's guidance. You can notice in verse 15 that coercion that causes people to speak and to worship under the threat of death. You can notice in verse 17 that people aren't able to buy or sell unless they have the mark of the beast, or the name, or the number of his name. And we can note as we read through the book of Revelation, study the book of Revelation, that this beast power, we can see a little bit earlier in Revelation 13, that it does signs and wonders. It causes people to worship. And this quality, or we wouldn't think of it in a positive sense, this characteristic of this approach is deception and coercion and force. That's how Satan works. Deception, coercion, and force. So the Bible paints a picture in the last days that our nation, along with others, will use deception, coercion, and force to try to get people to live their lives in the religious realm in a certain way. It's like the Bible speaks, they will kill you and they'll think they're doing God's will. Isn't that what Jesus said when he spoke about the persecution that people would encounter? The reality is, and again, we won't focus a whole lot here in Revelation, the reality is in Revelation that the end time scenario where religious liberty is taken away, it's not taken away by people who are secularists. It's taken away by people who claim to be Christians. It's not taken away by secularists, it's taken away by people who claim to be Christians. We live in a time right now where a lot of the conservative Christian church in the United States is concerned that secularists are going to take away our religious liberty. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't advocate for religious liberty when it's under attack by people who are secularists. And there is the reality that is happening at some level today in our nation. But the biblical scenario is that when we lose religious liberty, it's going to be taken away by people who claim to be Christians, by people who claim to be following Christ. That persecution will come, and our free exercise of liberty, religious liberty, will be under attack by people who claim to be Christians, people who claim to be following God, people like my friend back in the early time in my ministry who believe that the way for continued prosperity in our nation is to codify, is to force people to live their lives a certain way, and that would make them, and that would make us Christian as a nation. That's what Satan tries to do in the last days. He uses deception, coercion, and force to try to make people live their lives a certain way. The method that Satan uses is problematic. Even if, for some people, the end goal might be admirable. Do I want people to go to church? Absolutely. Do I want people to live moral, upstanding lives? Absolutely. Do I want people to pray? Absolutely. But should people be forced to do those things, especially when it comes to their relationship with God? Absolutely not. So we're going to live in the last days in a nation, according to Bible prophecy, that is going to take away freedom from God's people, religious liberty, religious freedom, try to force people to worship and live in a certain way, and it's going to be done by people who think, or at least profess, to be doing the will of God. It's going to happen not from secularists, but from so-called Christians. Satan, using deception, coercion, and force to try to get people to live their lives in the spiritual sense, worship becomes the main issue, trying to get people to worship in a way that's contrary to God's will. That's Satan's approach. And we can look at that and say there is no liberty. There is no liberty when Satan's method is utilized. I want to contrast that briefly with Christ's method, and that's in Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. So Satan's approach is deception, coercion, and force. And when Satan's method is used, even if it's being used to advance a positive option, a positive end, it's wrong. It is wrong. Matthew chapter 11, notice Jesus. Jesus beginning in verse 28. Well, let's begin in verse 25. Jesus says, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and prudent, have revealed them to babies. Even so, Father, for so it seemed good in your sight. All things, Jesus said, have been delivered to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him. Come to me, verse 28, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What a contrast to the approach we see in Revelation chapter 13, where deception, coercion, and force is used to try to get people to live their lives in a certain way, to try to get people to worship in a certain way. Jesus, his method is different. He invites, come to me, all you who labor and heavy laden, I will give you rest. We know in the end times, Revelation, the central issue at the end times will be one of worship. Jesus in Matthew 11 says, come to me, all you who labor and heavy laden, I will give you what? I will give you rest. What is the biblical commandment that has to do with rest in the Bible? It's the Sabbath commandment. Sabbath means rest. Shabbat, the Hebrew word for Sabbath, is rest. In Genesis chapter 2, where God finishes creating this world. And he, says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all, well, I'm quoting the Sabbath commandment, actually, not what it says here in Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth and the host of them were finished, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. God blessed the seventh day, sanctified it, because in it he'd rested from all his work which God had created and made. The word in there for rest is Shabbat. It's Sabbath. That's what Sabbath means. It is rest. In Matthew chapter 11, God invites us to come to him. Jesus says, I will give you rest. And the symbol of that rest is the Sabbath that God has instituted. It is the central issue in the end times, the issue of worship. Satan uses deception, coercion, and force to try to get people to honor, we understand from Revelation, it will be the first day of the week. That is a central focus, and it will be, of making that day or keeping that day or trying to keep that day holy. And Jesus said, if you want rest, come to me. Come. It's an invitation. It's a choice. Jesus invites us to come to him. He doesn't force us. Even in the Old Testament with the nation of Israel, where I mentioned there was no religious liberty, there really wasn't, right? But God didn't force his people to leave Egypt. He invited them to come, and they chose to come. There were some who walked away, and that was an option that God gave as well. God uses an invitation. Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. So in the end times, even though we know the Sabbath is a central and important issue, God doesn't want us to use force or legislation to try to get people to worship God as he instructs them to. I mean, if there was going to be a law that would force worship, it should be the Sabbath, right? I mean, that's the right way of worship. And yet Jesus says, if you want rest, just come to me. I'm not going to force you. I'm going to invite you. Come unto me, all you who labor and heavy laden, I will give you rest. And this is a rest that is not devoid of responsibilities. It's not devoid of labor. It's not devoid of obedience. It's not devoid of rules or laws, because Jesus said in verse 29, take my yoke upon you, learn from me, I'm gentle, lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. The true rest that Jesus gives us is a rest that involves labor. Why do you put a yoke on an animal? To put that animal to work. To put that animal to work. You know, it's interesting, in the Sabbath commandment, we're to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Don't do any work in it. In order to appreciate rest, we need to work. We need to labor. And as we appreciate the rest that Jesus gives us, the spiritual rest, there are responsibilities, there is a work to do that God gives to each one of us. Jesus says we need to take up our cross daily and follow him. So this rest in Christ is not devoid of labor and work and responsibility. It involves working with Jesus, walking with Jesus, laboring with Jesus, allowing him to work with and in and through us. So in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, was there religious liberty? Well, there was if you chose to follow God. Today, do we have religious liberty? By and large, we do, don't we? By and large, we do. But there's coming a day when we won't. What about in heaven and on the new earth? Will there be religious liberty? Well, those, Revelation chapter 20, what do we find happening at the end of the millennium? On this earth, those who choose to reject God, what happens to them? They're destroyed in the lake of fire. Sin is eradicated. I mean, after all, as there's religious liberty, shouldn't God allow people to choose to reject him as God? There's a destruction that happens. Sin is eradicated. You know, I think I was going earlier in the sermon, I kept saying theodicy, that the nation of Israel was a theodicy. It was a theocracy, not a theodicy. The issue of the destruction of the wicked is an issue of theodicy, God's justice and God's character. There's religious liberty in the new earth for those who accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. And then there's freedom. There is freedom. You know, the Apostle Paul, in Galatians, he talks about how when you're a son, you're the same as a slave in a master's house. When you're a child, because even though you're the one who's going to inherit everything that your father owns, you're no better than the slave because people are telling you what to do all the time. Isn't that what we do to kids? Right, kids? Do your parents tell you what to do? Yep. When you have to get up, what you have to eat, you got to brush your teeth. You have chores you have to do. You have to go to school. You're going to have to study. There's all this telling what to do. That's a reality. Even though you're a son or a daughter of the master and everything belongs to you, you get told what to do just like a servant or an employee does. That's just the way it is. It is preparing you for when you grow up, then you get to choose. And that's what God is seeking to do for us today. He is guiding and instructing us. We are, according to Matthew 11, if we'll come unto Jesus, we are yoked with him. We're working together with him. He's instructing and teaching us and preparing us so that when we grow up, and that's the purpose for the gifts of the Spirit in the church, are to help us all grow up so we're like Jesus, and we get to heaven, we get to the new earth, when all restrictions are removed, when all external forces that encourage or sometimes almost force us to do what is right, when all that is removed, we choose to live like Jesus. And we're at liberty, perfect freedom, because we are expressing in our worship, in our praise, in the lives we live, what comes from our hearts. Hearts that have been truly transformed by the grace of Jesus. We think about religious liberty. What is most important about liberty is not what happens outside of us, but it's what's happening in our hearts. It's easy to get caught up in advocating, and we should, for liberty in our nation. It's easy to get concerned and overworked and exercised about a concern that the godless Democrats or the fundamentalist Republicans, and I'm not taking a side on those issues, but that's typically the way a conservative, look at the Christian would say, look at the Democrats, they're the godless Democrats, and and liberal Christians look at the Republicans and they say, they're trying to make this into a theocracy. We shouldn't get exercised about either one of those because we know what's going to happen. What we need to be focusing on, am I growing up into a person who can live and value and enjoy and cherish for eternity the liberty that God will give me in heaven? Am I becoming a person that God can trust with immortality? And that comes from experiencing a liberty that isn't external, but a liberty that is internal. And as I grow up to become that kind of a man, that kind of a Christian, then I am willing to joyfully live out my faith despite the consequences. Whether I live in a nation that has religious liberty or not won't change the way I live my life. As I close, there was a father who had a young boy. And in their family, they always prayed before they ate, as I hope you do in your family, we do in mine. And one day, this father took his son out to eat at a restaurant. And when they walked into the restaurant, the father noticed some of his work colleagues were there. And as they sat down to eat, he was a little bit embarrassed to pray out loud with his son. And so he told his son, he said, "Son, we'll pray silently." And so they bowed their heads and closed their eyes, and the father mumbled to himself a quick little prayer, opened his eyes, and he saw his little boy sitting there still with his bowed head, his closed eyes, and his folded hands. And the father waited for his son to finish the silent prayer. And the son was not finishing the silent prayer, and so finally the father said, "Son, that's a rather long prayer. What's being said?" And the son opened his eyes, and he looked at his dad. He says, "I don't know. It's a silent prayer. You didn't say anything." The boy was waiting because he knew his dad was always the one who said the prayer, and it's a silent prayer, so he was confused. He didn't know what was being said or how long the prayer should be because it was being done silently. I think sometimes we're Christians like that father, and we want all the external forces to be arranged in just a certain way so that we can easily live out our faith. But the men and women, boys and girls who live with true religious liberty, it's a freedom that comes from the heart. And it's a freedom that compels us to live our faith out loud, regardless of the consequences, because we know that we are with Jesus. "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest." Freedom is only found in Jesus. Dear Heavenly Father, today we thank you so much that you desire us to have freedom. And we thank you that we are part of a church that actively advocates for religious liberty. We know we shouldn't just sit by and allow freedoms to disappear, but we also know that ultimately those external freedoms will be taken away. But I pray that we, by walking with Jesus, by coming to him day by day, would be transformed and from the heart experience the true freedom, the freedom from sin that comes from knowing Jesus. Thank you that you love us. And thank you that you are growing us to be men and women, boys and girls, who can live eternally with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. May God bless each one of you as we live with freedom, despite what external forces may try to constrain our liberty in Christ. May God bless you each and every one. As we depart, we won't sing our closing hymn today, but as we depart, I want to again remind you about our special Sabbath next week, next Sabbath, as we meet with, or as we have Joshua White from A Thinking Generation joining us for the day, and then 2 Sabbaths from today, 2 weeks from today, we'll be celebrating the communion service. God bless each one of you.